He's attacking the girl!" The scream sliced through the humming noise of Lincoln Mall like a blade. Conversations died mid-sentence. Shoppers froze with half-filled bags dangling from their fingers, and the overhead music cut like it had never been there to begin with. Somewhere near the east entrance, a woman's coffee cup hit the floor and shattered. A toddler burst into tears, and all eyes, every single one, locked onto the same scene unraveling before them. A police K-9, muscles coiled and eyes wild, sprinting straight toward a child. The little girl sat alone, barely more than a heap of soaked pink fabric, curled on the bench with her arms around her knees. She didn't move, didn't flinch. Her face was half hidden beneath the hood of a raincoat 2 sizes too big. She looked impossibly small, vulnerable, and now completely defenseless against what looked like a snarling missile of fur and muscle. Gasps tore through the crowd. Phones went up, recording. A man stepped in front of his son. A woman clutched her purse to her chest, backing away like the floor had turned molten. The dog didn't stop. But just before contact, mere feet from the child, he veered. The German Shepherd launched sideways, jaws open, and collided with the blur of motion emerging from behind a large retail kiosk. A man staggered as the dog hit him, a duffel bag flying from his grip. Something silver clattered to the tile, an uncapped syringe, and the bag landed with a muffled thud, its contents spilling. Rope, black gloves, a roll of duct tape, and something else that no one wanted to examine too closely. The man let out a grunt of surprise, then panic. He swung at the dog, missing. The shepherd snarled, teeth bared, and locked onto his arm with lethal precision, driving him to the ground as chaos erupted behind them. Officer Noah Bennett was already sprinting. He'd felt Ranger tense a split second before the bark, saw his partner lunge across the mall tile like he'd been fired from a cannon, heard the scream before he spotted the man. Tall, pale, mid-40s, fading stubble, thin frame. The syringe hit the ground before Noah was halfway across the floor. Now, Noah dropped onto the man's back with trained speed, forcing his arms behind him with a sharp twist and locking the cuffs tight. The man thrashed, not saying a word, just breathing hard and staring at the girl with something in his eyes that made Noah's stomach turn. "Martin Cleary," Noah muttered under his breath. "I knew your name would come up one day." The man didn't respond, but Noah had already stopped listening. His attention had shifted sharply to the girl. She hadn't moved an inch. The child sat motionless on the edge of the bench, knees still hugged to her chest. Her locket glinted from beneath the collar of her coat. She was staring not at Noah or even the man being dragged away by mall security, but at the dog, at Ranger. Ranger had stepped away from the takedown the moment Noah arrived, as he always did. He now stood a few feet from the girl, ears slightly back, tail low, head tilted, not in aggression, but something that looked eerily close to recognition. Noah moved slowly, palms open. "Hi there," he said softly. "I'm Officer Bennett, that's Ranger. He's not here to hurt you." The girl blinked just once, then looked down at the crumpled piece of paper in her lap, one corner damp and torn. She didn't speak. Noah's voice dropped even lower. "Is your name Olivia?" This time, no words, just the faintest movement. A tiny nod, nearly imperceptible. Her lip trembled. Noah exhaled and whispered into his shoulder mic, "We've got her. Olivia Harper, alive." Just 4 hours earlier, it had been raining. Not hard, just that steady gray drizzle Nebraska seemed to specialize in. Noah had driven into the precinct with the wipers on low and Ranger's tongue lolling out the side of his mouth, unconcerned as always. The radio call had come in barely 30 minutes later. Amber Alert. 6-year-old girl taken from a pharmacy parking lot while her mother was inside. Vehicle unknown. Witnesses none. The only image, a grainy, time-stamped clip from a neighboring security camera. A shadowy adult figure holding a child's hand, leading her into the rain. Noah had stared at the photo in the briefing room like it was a ghost. He didn't say anything at first, just quietly picked up Ranger's leash and walked out before anyone asked why his hands were shaking. Eliza would have been 28 this year. If she'd lived. If she hadn't stopped to get milk at the wrong gas station. If the armed robbery hadn't gone sideways. If he'd been the one on shift that night instead of off-duty, nursing whiskey and bitterness. He could still see her smile in the flicker of fluorescent light. Still hear the voicemail she left that he never answered. Now, another girl, another chance, and a dog who seemed to understand more than most people ever would. Ranger had led him here. No solid lead, no trail, just instinct, and the unwavering pull of a dog who'd dragged Noah out of the darkest pit of his life and hadn't stopped saving him since. Back at the mall, paramedics were gently checking Olivia's pulse. She flinched when they touched her sleeve. But when Ranger stepped closer, lowering himself carefully to the floor beside her, she reached out and tangled her fingers in his fur. Not with hesitation, with relief. One of the medics glanced at Noah, eyebrows raised. She hasn't said anything, but she seems calm when he's close. "He can stay," Noah said simply. Ranger pressed his head lightly into her shoulder, tail thumping once. A moment passed, quiet but whole. Then Olivia whispered, so softly Noah almost missed it. He wasn't scared. The medic leaned closer. Who wasn't? She didn't answer, just clutched Ranger tighter like she already knew he was the reason she'd made it through whatever she'd run from. Outside, Martin Cleary sat hunched in the back of a squad car, eyes fixed on nothing, hands twitching in cuffs. Noah stood a few feet away, rain speckling the shoulders of his uniform. "He's been a ghost for years," one of the detectives muttered beside him. "Popped up in 3 different child endangerment investigations. Never enough to pin anything down." Noah said nothing. "Lucky you were here," the detective added. Noah looked through the glass again. "No," he said quietly. Lucky Ranger was. And he meant it. Because 5 years ago he'd been standing on the ledge of a parking garage, a gun in his hand and a note in his back pocket. And it was Ranger, then barely out of training, who'd found him before anyone else. Who sat beside him for hours, quiet and unmoving, until Noah put the gun away and walked down the stairs. No one could have saved him that day, except maybe a dog who hadn't been scared, just like today. 3 minutes, that's all it took. 3 days ago, Tessa Harper had stepped into the corner pharmacy just long enough to grab a bottle of antibiotics. The prescription had been ready since morning, and Olivia, freshly out of a fever, had been buckled safely in the back seat with her favorite stuffed cat and a peanut butter sandwich cut into heart shapes. It was the kind of small-town errand Tessa had done 100 times, the kind you don't second-guess until you do. When she returned to the car, the sandwich was still there. But Olivia wasn't. The scream that left Tessa's throat didn't sound human. It tore through her ribs like a fire alarm, set her running through the parking lot barefoot, her shoes forgotten by the curb. But no one had seen a thing. No screech of tires, no stranger loitering, no witness to the moment her 6-year-old disappeared from the back seat of a locked sedan parked under a security camera that had, of course, stopped recording 3 weeks earlier. And somewhere, not far from that chaos, Olivia Harper was running. Her legs ached. Her socks were soaked. The heart-shaped sandwich had fallen out of her coat pocket back near the gas station where the man, Martin, he'd said his name was Martin, had pulled over to make a phone call. he'd left the van unlocked. She'd heard the door slam. She waited 3 breaths, then ran. It had felt like a dream, or maybe one of those books her mother read to her, except in those, the girl always had a flashlight and a brave friend and a note that led the way home. Olivia had none of those things, only a piece of paper balled in her fist with her mom's phone number, written in red ink, and the heart-shaped locket bouncing against her collarbone, warm from where she'd clutched it for hours in the dark. She didn't remember how she found Lincoln Mall. She just remembered the smell of popcorn and hot pretzels, the way people brushed past her without looking down, the way the benches near the east entrance were dry and low to the ground. Safe. If she stayed still, maybe he wouldn't find her again. And so she waited. Kenny Ruiz had only taken the mall job to pay for community college. Part-time security wasn't glamorous, and patrolling Lincoln Mall during midweek drizzle was usually about as exciting as counting ceiling tiles. But something about the girl didn't sit right with him. He saw her during his second loop, small, hunched, not moving. No adult nearby, no shopping bags, no food, no lost toy that might have explained the tears that hadn't quite made it to her cheeks. Just stillness. That eerie kind of silence that kids usually don't have unless something inside them has gone quiet too. "Sweetheart," he said, kneeling down beside her. "You okay? Where's your mom or dad?" She didn't answer. Her hands gripped a piece of paper so tight it had begun to tear. Kenny didn't push. He'd seen trauma up close. His cousin Alex had gone through something awful a few years back, and he recognized the same glassy look in this kid's eyes. So instead, he nodded to his radio, murmured something low to the desk inside the office, and took a slow step back. He stayed nearby, watching. The man in the dark coat appeared 5 minutes later. He hadn't been there before, Kenny was sure of it. The guy came around from behind the coffee kiosk with a stiff gait and eyes that didn't blink enough. He scanned the crowd too deliberately, shoulders hunched like he was trying to make himself smaller. And when his gaze landed on the girl, something about the way he smiled sent goosebumps up Kenny's arms. That's when Kenny made the call. He didn't know it yet, but that decision, pressing the red button clipped to his belt, was the moment that saved her life. Back in the police cruiser, Noah sat quietly as Olivia's mother clutched her daughter like the world had nearly ended, and hadn't quite decided to restart yet. Tessa Harper was shaking. She'd arrived at the mall 20 minutes after the call from dispatch, ignoring protocol, speeding through red lights, throwing the car into park while the door was still swinging open. She had sprinted into the food court, keys still in hand, heart lodged somewhere between her stomach and her throat. And there was her daughter, alive, in a silver foil blanket, her hand resting on a police dog's head like it was the only thing tethering her to the ground. When their eyes met, Olivia didn't speak. She just rose slowly, cautiously, and walked straight into her mother's arms. She clung to her like a buoy, and then finally, she cried, the kind of cry that had been stuck in her chest since the moment the van door slammed. That night, after the press left, after Olivia had been checked out by paramedics and cleared for release, Tessa sat with her daughter in the hospital room, both of them still in their clothes from that awful day. A nurse came by with a warm meal Olivia didn't touch. The heart-shaped locket was still around her neck. Her fingers rubbed at it absently, like the motion itself had power. Tessa leaned over, smoothing her daughter's hair. "He didn't hurt you, did he?" Olivia shook her head. Her lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. But then, after a long moment, she reached into her coat pocket and handed her mother the crumpled paper. The ink had run, but Tessa recognized the numbers. It was her phone number, written exactly the way she'd taught Olivia in case of emergency. Only one word was added, scribbled in shaky block letters on the back. Martin. Tessa pressed the note to her chest. Her voice cracked when she whispered, "You remembered." Olivia nodded once and then added, just above a whisper, "I tried to stay invisible." Outside the room, Ranger sat at attention near the door. When Olivia noticed him, something in her posture relaxed. She motioned quietly, and the nurse, unsure but not about to argue, let the dog in. He padded across the floor and laid down beside the bed. Olivia curled up beside him, her arm draped over his back. Her breathing slowed, and for the first time in 2 days, she closed her eyes without flinching. Down the hallway, Noah leaned on the vending machine, half a bottle of water untouched in his hand. Kenny Ruiz stood across from him, shifting awkwardly from foot to foot. "You did good," Noah said finally. I don't know. I saw something in her face." Kenny shrugged. "Didn't feel right. That guy looked like he belonged to a different world than the one she came from." Noah studied the young man for a moment. "Sometimes that's enough." Kenny looked toward the hospital room. "She's gonna be okay, right?" Noah didn't answer right away. Then, "She already is." "She survived. That's more than most get." They both fell silent. Ranger reappeared a few minutes later, fur ruffled, eyes bright. He walked straight up to Noah and sat, chest high, tail sweeping the floor. Noah crouched and scratched behind his ears. "Good work, partner." Ranger leaned into him with a weight that said more than any medal or award ever could. And somewhere behind those closed doors, the little girl in the raincoat slept. For the first time in what felt like forever, Martin Cleary didn't put up much of a fight. He hit the tile hard, face first, with Ranger's weight pinning his chest and Noah's knee driving between his shoulder blades. By the time the cuffs locked, his fingers had already gone limp. He never screamed, never cursed, just lay there breathing like someone who knew the game was finally over. When they hauled him up and led him through the echoing corridor of Lincoln Mall, blood from a split lip drying along his jawline, a dozen shoppers stood in silence, their phones lowered now, their disbelief heavier than fear. And somewhere, a little girl in a too-big raincoat clung to a dog like he was the only thing real in the world. Standing just outside the observation window, Noah watched Martin Cleary through the one-way glass. The man hadn't moved much since being brought in. His shoulders slumped slightly forward, hands folded in front of him like a child waiting for scolding. He hadn't asked for a lawyer, hadn't said a word beyond confirming his name, and even that had been clipped, like it cost him more than he wanted to give. His expression held no panic, no urgency, just that quiet, infuriating smugness Noah had seen too often in men who thought the system couldn't touch them. Yet behind all that composure, there was a flicker, a subtle twitch beneath his eye when Ranger appeared in the hallway. He'd seen the dog, and he remembered. Noah could feel the shift in Ranger's weight beside him. It wasn't aggression. It was recognition. That same weight he'd felt years ago when Ranger had picked up a trail from a wounded veteran missing in the woods. That same posture he took the day Eliza's body had been found, when the dog laid silently beside her hospital bed, unwilling to leave her even in death. Now, that same unreadable stillness returned, and it pressed something cold against the back of Noah's neck. Detective Marie Lowell entered the hallway quietly, her boots making almost no sound against the floor, but Ranger noticed her instantly. She gave the shepherd a respectful nod before joining Noah in front of the window. In her hands, she carried a thin case file, worn at the edges and sealed with a red sticker that suggested it had been sitting in archive longer than anyone liked to admit. She tapped it once against her palm before handing it over, her voice low and level, as if even in a police precinct, words could cut the wrong way. "We pulled his employment history," she said, watching Cleary's still figure like it might start moving if she blinked. "He worked at Flatridge, back in Colorado, you know it?" Noah didn't answer immediately, his eyes locked on the man inside, but the file in his hands told him enough before he even opened it. The name was printed in black across the header: Martin Cleary, Security and Kennel Technician, Flatridge K-9 Training Division. The flood of memory that came next didn't crash. It seeped. Flatridge had been the kind of place that trained elite dogs and burned through people. Noah had been rotated there twice during his early years with the program, long before Ranger. The facility was remote, military contracted, and home to some of the hardest, sharpest animals in the system. The kind of place where discipline came first and softness didn't survive long. Cleary had been background noise there, a face in a uniform shirt, always sweeping, always watching, never in the way, but never quite invisible either. No one liked him, that wasn't rare, but the dogs, Noah remembered that part. They didn't just dislike him, they feared him. It had been subtle. Dogs flinching when he walked by, one shepherd refusing to eat for days after being kenneled on Cleary's shift, another snapping at thin air in the dead of night, eyes wide and tail tucked. They were signs trainers chalked up to stress, to exhaustion, to the strain of the program. But now, staring at that name printed so plainly in front of him, Noah realized they had all missed it. He hurt them, Noah said, almost to himself. The words not so much spoken as released. He didn't just hate them, he conditioned them. Lowell didn't argue. She handed over a second sheet, this one a scanned copy of a staff complaint filed by an anonymous handler nearly 9 years ago. It referenced unauthorized discipline and potentially abusive noise aversion exposure, but nothing had ever come of it. No footage, no corroboration, no dog had come forward to testify. Flatridge wrote him off as a low-priority liability, she added, her voice bitter. They let him go before anyone could make it official. And now he's back, Noah muttered, rubbing a hand along his jaw as Ranger sat beside him, still unblinking, still locked onto that scent. Still following the same patterns, he opened the next folder without waiting. The maps they found in Cleary's rental car were crude but deliberate, hand-drawn city grids with red circles marking specific sites, shopping malls, parking garages, playgrounds. There were no dates, no labels, just locations and lines connecting them like some grotesque web. 4 cities, 3 missing girls in the last 18 months, all unsolved, all within 5 miles of one of Cleary's red circles. Lincoln had been circled 3 times. Noah felt the bile rise in his throat. Olivia hadn't been a target of opportunity. She had been part of a plan, a long one. He was mapping them, Noah said, his voice hardening. Not just taking them, scouting, timing, repeating. Lowell leaned against the wall, arms crossed, the weight of what they were uncovering sinking deeper into her spine. This isn't just about Olivia. No, Noah agreed. It never was. Back at the hospital, Olivia sat cross-legged on her bed, a pad of thick paper balanced across her lap. She drew slowly, with the kind of focus only children have when they're trying to make something real again. Her mother sat nearby, tired eyes watching every crayon stroke like they were decoding a story she wasn't ready to hear out loud. On the page, Olivia had drawn a kiosk, a bench, and a dog. She'd drawn the man too, hiding in the shadows behind the coffee stand, a black line curling from his hand toward the little girl sitting alone. And in front of that girl, like a wall of fur and fire, was Ranger. She colored him carefully, coat the right shade of brown and black, eyes a kind of fierce yellow, Above his head, in shaky capital letters, she wrote, "He knew first." When her mother asked what it meant, Olivia didn't look up. "He smelled him," she said, "before he even moved. He smelled the bat on him." That evening, Kenny Ruiz stood at the police station entrance with a small paper bag in his hands and a badge clipped to his collar that still didn't feel real. He wasn't sure why he'd come back, only that he hadn't been able to stop thinking about the girl or the dog or the moment his gut had told him something was wrong. When Noah met him in the hallway, Kenny offered the bag awkwardly, revealing a child-sized red security vest and a felt badge stitched with care. "She gave me a drawing," Kenny said, his voice quiet. "Said I was her mall hero. Figured maybe she'd want to be one too." Noah didn't say much, just gave a small nod and clapped him once on the shoulder. "You did good." As Kenny walked away, Ranger padded up beside Noah and sat with a quiet thump. He didn't look back at the door. He didn't need to. Because somewhere in the stillness of that night, the smell that Ranger had never forgotten was still in the building. Still waiting to be confronted. Still remembered. By the time the door to Martin Cleary's rented garage was pried open, the sun had already dipped behind the horizon, casting long skeletal shadows through the cracked windows that hadn't been cleaned in years. The building sat near the edge of a dead-end industrial street just off Route 28, invisible from the road unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. And they wouldn't have known. No patrol would have stumbled across it. No search warrant would have included it. If Ranger hadn't kept circling the precinct's evidence locker, pausing at Cleary's duffel bag every time he passed, nose twitching like there was something more buried inside than rope and duct tape. It had taken Noah less than 20 minutes to piece it together. Cleary's shoe, worn through at the heel, had a faint number smudged along the arch. 8826L. A code. Not a date, a reference. And the corresponding file they pulled from Lincoln County's abandoned property register had led them here. The scent hit before they even reached the staircase. Not strong, not fresh, but familiar enough that Ranger froze at the top step, his entire frame tensing as his front paw hovered midair like he wasn't sure if he wanted to enter or warn them away. Noah didn't push him. He stepped forward instead, hand resting gently on the shepherd's shoulder for just a moment, grounding them both before the first boot touched concrete. The stairs creaked under their weight, wood soft from moisture, the air below turning colder with each step until they were swallowed by the dark. Noah switched on his flashlight, and the beam landed directly on the wall. The names weren't painted, they were carved, scratched deep with something jagged, etched in overlapping layers like the repetition of the act meant something to the man who made them. Some were printed in childlike block letters, others sprawled in cursive like a fever dream. But every one of them, dozens in total, belonged to someone who had once been small and scared and real. Detective Lowell followed close behind, her own flashlight casting slow, careful arcs across the space. She said nothing at first, just stood beside Noah and took in the horror in pieces. Then her voice dropped, low and tight. "Tell me I'm not reading this right." Noah didn't answer, because his light had stopped on one name, Eliza. It wasn't just etched like the others, it was circled, twice, in thick, fading red ink, the kind of color that soaked into concrete and never quite left. Beneath it, 3 dates were scratched in slanting, uneven digits. The last one matched the night she died. He blinked once, hard, jaw tightening against a memory that had never softened with time. Lowell shifted beside him, the realization settling fast. She wasn't random, was she? He shook his head, not trusting himself to speak. "Noah," she started, but he stepped forward before she could finish. He reached out and pressed his hand to the wall, not to touch her name exactly, but to feel the coldness in the stone, as if trying to confirm it wasn't just a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and grief. The chill that met his palm was very real, just like the knot in his chest. Cleary had known her, had marked her, not because she was his target, but because she had been his warning. The rest of the room felt more like a bunker than a basement. On the far wall, a cot leaned against rusted steel legs, the mattress stripped bare, stained with water and time. Next to it stood a makeshift board made of plywood, pinned with photographs torn from yearbooks, school directories, even printed Facebook profile pictures that had been folded and annotated by hand. Red thread stretched between them in jagged lines, connecting names to cities, schools to intersections. Lincoln was circled in bold marker, a date scrawled below it. 2 days ago. In the corner, a child's shoe, mud-stained, glitter peeling from the heel, sat beside a broken music box. The melody strip still dangled from its hinge like something left mid-song. Lowell pulled her radio from her belt, voice flat. "We need CSU, full sweep, now." Noah walked the perimeter slowly, careful not to step on anything that looked like a memory. And when he reached the back wall, he saw it. A set of tally marks. 4 in a row, 1 crossed out. He didn't need to guess what that meant. Olivia had been the 5th, and the only one who got away. At the precinct, Cleary sat straighter now, as if he somehow knew they had found the truth and wanted to appear composed before it unraveled him. He didn't look surprised when Noah entered the room again, only bored, almost smug, the way a spider might wait for a struggling fly to stop moving. But this time, Noah didn't come alone. Ranger stepped in beside him, his presence immediate, commanding, the room shifting with the air of a creature that had known pain and survived it. He didn't growl, didn't bark, didn't pace. He just stared, right at Cleary. The man looked away first. "You want to talk about Flatridge?" Noah asked, voice steady, cold and quiet. "Or about what you did to dogs who couldn't speak for themselves, so you moved on to children who wouldn't be believed?" Cleary remained silent. "You knew Eliza," Noah continued, no longer asking. "You followed her home, you watched her routines, you wrote her name on a wall like she was nothing more than another entry on your list." Something flickered behind Cleary's eyes. A crack, subtle but there. Noah leaned in. "She saw you that day, didn't she, at the school, and that scared you?" Cleary shifted, the first real movement he'd made in minutes. Ranger took a single step forward, and the man flinched. That was all the confession Noah needed. That night, as the building settled into silence, and the weight of the day finally pressed into Noah's bones, he sat outside the evidence room with Ranger curled at his feet. He pulled a small envelope from his jacket pocket, Eliza's handwriting across the front, still sharp, still careful, and turned it in his fingers, once, then again. He didn't open it. Not yet. But he didn't put it away either. And somewhere down the hall, Olivia sat with her mother in the station break room, coloring a new drawing. A girl in a red vest, standing beside a dog with fire in his eyes. She wrote one word underneath it. Safe. The sky above Lincoln bloomed slowly into morning, casting a warm haze over the schoolyard where folding chairs stood in imperfect rows, and banners trembled gently in the breeze, like they, too, were holding their breath. In front of Lincoln Elementary, parents checked their watches, teachers adjusted clipboards, and clusters of children fidgeted near the steps in outfits their mothers had probably laid out the night before. Each one waiting for the event they'd been rehearsing all week, Community Heroes Day. Noah Bennett sat in his truck, parked along the curb, hands resting on the wheel without turning the ignition, as the soft thud of Ranger's tail against the passenger seat filled the quiet space between them. He had arrived early, too early, and yet still hadn't convinced himself to open the door. Resting across his lap was a tie, nothing flashy, just charcoal gray, slightly creased from where it had been folded in the glove box for years, untouched since Eliza's funeral. He had kept it all this time, tucked beneath old insurance cards and dog treat wrappers, as if one day he might need to remember what it felt like to stand in front of people, not as a cop, not as a man haunted by failure, but simply as someone worthy of being seen again. With a long breath that stretched deep into the corners of his chest, he buttoned his collar, looped the tie, and tightened the knot with hands steadier than they'd been in months. When he finally stepped out of the vehicle, the air hit him with that soft, early spring chill, the kind that reminded him life was still cycling forward, whether he was ready for it or not. Ranger followed immediately, the weight of his paws purposeful on the pavement, ears alert, tail low and calm. A quiet sentinel in a custom vest stitched with a new patch that read, Public Educator K-9 Division. They crossed the schoolyard side by side, passing parents and children who turned to look. Not with fear, not with confusion, but with a kind of reverence reserved only for those who had once stood between danger and someone too small to defend themselves. For the first time in a long while, no part of Noah wanted to retreat into the background. The silence he used to wear like armor had begun to soften, and in its place stood something closer to peace. At the edge of the stage, Olivia Harper stood waiting in her red vest, her yellow dress peeking out beneath, a felt badge slightly crooked on her shoulder where someone had hand-stitched the word Junior Assistant. She looked taller somehow, not in inches but in presence, as if the fear that had once wrapped around her so tightly had finally begun to loosen its grip. Her eyes locked onto Ranger first, then up at Noah, and a smile spread across her face in a way that made him feel like the hours spent chasing ghosts and doubting himself might finally be outweighed by this moment. With a slight nudge from her teacher, Olivia stepped forward toward the microphone, her chin lifted, hands steady, the tips of her shoes brushing the edge of the wooden stage as her voice broke through the morning with a clarity that silenced the small crowd around her. "I used to think being quiet would keep me safe," she said, her voice trembling at first but growing with each word, "because I thought if I didn't speak, he wouldn't find me again. But then Ranger barked, not because I asked him to, not because anyone told him to. He barked because he knew I couldn't." The crowd didn't move, didn't murmur, didn't shift in their seats. They listened. "And when he did," she continued, her voice rising just enough to carry, "he stopped the bad man, and he saved me." She paused for only a moment, eyes finding Ranger again, her smile softening. "I didn't know dogs could hear things no one said out loud," she added, "but Ranger did. And because he did, I'm still here." There was no roaring applause, no explosion of cheering, just a steady, rising swell of clapping that spread from the teachers to the students and out to the parents gathered along the sidewalk. An applause that felt like acknowledgement more than celebration, as if every hand striking together was saying, "We see you now." Noah remained near the edge of the crowd, watching the small figures standing on that stage speak truths grown-ups still struggled to name. He felt something warm crack open in his chest, an ache that wasn't pain anymore, but release. Ranger pressed gently against his leg, tail thumping once, steady and sure, as if confirming that, yes, this moment was theirs too. After the ceremony, as children crowded around Ranger for photos and hesitant pats on the head, Olivia threaded her way back to Noah. Her fingers curled around the edge of her vest like she was unsure whether she was allowed to ask what she wanted. When she finally reached him, she looked up and grinned with a familiarity that no longer came with hesitation. "You wore a tie," she said, eyes twinkling with mischief and sincerity. Noah smirked, tugging at the knot. "Don't tell anyone," he replied. "I'm still not convinced it matches my dog." Olivia laughed, a sound that had been missing far too long in her world, and leaned forward to hug Ranger, whispering something into his ear that only he could hear. Whatever it was, he wagged his tail in perfect understanding. In the days that followed, requests began pouring into the department, first from nearby schools, then from others across the state, asking for Noah and Ranger to visit, to speak, to show up not as enforcers but as proof that sometimes the right kind of protection comes in the form of silent strength and well-earned trust. The outreach program, One Bark, before it's too late, gathered speed like a storm gathering wind, and though Noah never imagined himself as the face of anything, he soon found himself in classrooms and gymnasiums, standing beside Ranger as children stared up with eyes full of questions he didn't have to answer alone. Somewhere along the way, Olivia became more than a survivor. She became a storyteller. She stood in front of crowds and told them about the man in the mall, about the bench where she sat, about the sound Ranger made that cracked open her fear like thunder in a too-quiet room. She told them about finding her voice not from therapy or books or time, but from the moment a dog chose to listen before anyone else believed she was worth hearing. And every time she spoke, Ranger sat nearby, unbothered by flashbulbs or applause, watching her not like a hero guarding his legacy, but like a friend content to witness her becoming exactly who she was meant to be. On a quiet Sunday evening, long after the last school visit and long before the next one, Noah sat on the porch with a mug of coffee going cold in his hand. Across his lap rested a worn envelope, the seal long broken, the paper inside creased and stained with age. He read the letter again, the one Eliza had written weeks before her death, the one he hadn't been ready to read until Ranger found Olivia. Her words were soft, handwritten, filled with more forgiveness than he believed he deserved. And yet, somehow, they no longer tore him open. Ranger lay stretched out beside him, nose twitching as the wind carried scents of spring and distant storms. When Noah finally folded the letter closed and looked up at the setting sun casting long shadows across the porch, he smiled. Not because the pain had disappeared, but because it had finally been given somewhere to rest. Inside the house, laughter echoed from the kitchen where Tessa was trying to teach Olivia how to crack an egg without crushing it. The dog lifted his head slightly, ears flicking toward the sound, then turned back to Noah, tail tapping against the porch once, content. Noah reached down and scratched behind his ear, letting the quiet linger. "You were never just a dog," he whispered. And Ranger, as always, didn't need to answer.